This is Lecture 8, the last lecture of the Religions of Ancient Israel by Rabbi Lawrence Troster, and today we're going to finish our discussion of the priestly cultic religion and then look at the wisdom tradition. If you take a look at the material, we went through it, and I want to focus on one important aspect of what the priestly tradition did, which was to take rituals that were undoubtedly quite common in ancient Israel and transform them into more monotheistic rituals. In other words, more strict monotheistic rituals. What the priestly tradition was especially against was the notion of demons and magic, because the notion of one of the basic underlying ideas of the belief in magic is that there is a meta realm that is higher than the gods, that if you manipulate through magical words or rituals, you can in fact manipulate the gods. This is a basic idea of most pagan religions. Monotheism says there is no meta realm, there is only God, and therefore you cannot manipulate God through magical ritual. You can pray to God, you can ask for, you can give sacrifices and so on. And of course, there is this fine line sometimes between prayer and magic, but nonetheless, they were very much against this idea. And so what they did was to take anything that smacked of an anti-demonological ritual and transform it into a stricter monotheistic ritual. And I want to give you a couple of examples. So the most important one is the Yom Kippur ritual. So if you turn to page 244, chapter 16 of Leviticus, it's the beginning of Parshat Achrei Mod. This is the chapter where the ritual of Yom Kippur is described. And the Yom Kippur ritual is one of the most elaborate religious rituals of any religion. Okay, and the word Kippur really means purging. The idea of the purging, of the cleansing of the sanctuary from the accumulated sin of the people once a year. In other words, given the fact that the Israelites express their ideas in very concrete terms as opposed to abstract, sin was almost a physical reality that would attach itself like a fungus to the altar, which would eventually drive the kavod, the living presence of God, out of the sanctuary, which, to use one of my Bible teachers' rather blasphemous term, God is allergic to certain things. Okay, and so it would drive the divine presence out of the sanctuary, and if the divine presence leaves the sanctuary, then the community is, as we say in Yiddish, indreid, right? It's in a real problematic way, since the blessings of fertility and goodness on the earth all flow from the divine presence in its contact with the earth. So the Yom Kippur ritual is meant to purge that, but there is a fascinating little element here, which, of course, you all are aware of, the notion of the scapegoat. Mm-hmm. Namely, that at the beginning of the ritual, this is verse 6, that there's a series of sin offerings. The high priest, Aaron, has to do a sin offering for himself, to purify himself, and for the Kohanim, and then for the whole community. But part of that is there are two he-goats, and they draw lots. And it says in verse 8, one marked for the Lord and the other marked for Azazel. Now, what happens is that the high priest transfers the sin of the people as part of this ritual into the goat for Azazel, and then the goat for Azazel is sent off to the wilderness. It says in verse 10, while the goat designated by lot for Azazel shall be left standing alive before the Lord to make expiation with it and to send it off to the wilderness for Azazel. Now, you can imagine a later commentators, especially the rabbis, had to kind of explain what Azazel said. They explained it as a place, but there's no doubt about the fact it's a demon originally. But there's no hint of the fact that it is an offering for the demon. Okay? In other words, it says, if you go on the next page to verse 20 and 21, there's where the goat is brought forward. Aaron lays his hands upon the goat and confesses all of it, and it shall be sent off to the wilderness through a designated man. Thus the goat shall carry on it all their iniquities to an inaccessible region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. Now, this is, of course, a kind of sympathetic magic, which is often done in healing rituals, where you try to transfer the disease to another living creature, like a bird, and then you let it go, right? Now, there's no hint here that this is demonological, or rather, it's being an offering for the demons. But you can't get away from the kind of magical element in this. But it's been purged, as it were, of any reference to demons aside from Azazel, right?
Who is supposed to be...
Nothing. I mean, that's the point here. Azazel doesn't, it's just not explained. It's a remnant. The ritual has been... It's not an offering for the demons. Hi, Sam. Do you need a material, or did you copy it? Okay. We're on page 246 in the Tanakh. And so they try to, really drain it of any magical content. But there is a hint about what its original purpose. If you look at chapter 17 on 247, it says, it talks about,
which verse, Rabbi?
well, I'll get to it. Chapter 17 is about, various things about sacrifice and what's improper or improper. And then it says in verse 7 that they may offer their sacrifices no more to the goat demons after whom they stray. So it's pretty obvious that Azazel was a goat demon. In other words, a demon who would strike the goat herds. Okay? And the connection between the demonic and goats is long known. Pan was in the shape of a goat. The devil, the later iconic images of the devil have goat-like characteristics. So there, evidently, the Israelites believed, again, belief in demons was a normal thing in the ancient world. They believed in goat demons because, after all, the goat flocks were incredibly important for them. So they would propitiate the goat demon. And the priestly authors have tried to completely eliminate that ritual by the reforms that you see in the Yom Kippur ritual.
But just by the fact that they've got, the reference to Azazel and so on is still there.
Yeah, and the point is that what you see are that's, for lucky for us, they sometimes leave a little bit there. But part of it may also have to do with when they're doing these reforms, they have to in some ways preserve the form of the ritual and some aspects of it, even while transforming it. Because after all, when you come in and do this, there's a lot of people who are going to say, hey, wait a minute, if we don't propitiate the goat demons, our goat herds, what are you doing? In other words, this is a reform, and we don't even know how well it took hold in the first temple, under the priestly revolution. We know by the Second Temple period it had taken hold quite nicely, but magic never disappears. But this, again, this is a reformist, more strictly monotheistic, not as quite as strict as the Deuteronomy people, but certainly very important to them. Yes, sir.
I guess my question is, how is it a reform if it still talks about giving...
Because Azazel is vague. It's just off into the wilderness. It's not a demon anymore. They don't believe in demons, right?
They don't go more into it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
When on our high holy days, when they talk about the goats, it's like, we don't really know what this is about. It's just there.
What's the difference if they talk about the goat or the chicken?
Oh, you see, but well, that's not biblical. That's early medieval, the Kapparis. But there's an example of a magical ritual, and trying to replicate the scapegoat when there is no temple by transferring your sin to a chicken. Again, this idea of sympathy, of the transference of sin or illness to another animal, ever since the kappara, the kapparis appeared, there were rabbinical authorities who knew it was a rank magical ritual and tried to do away with it, but they were completely unsuccessful because, again, magic has a real existential attraction. It allows you to feel that you are not powerless before evil. Now, the original kapparis ritual, by the way, was that after you got the sin, the animal was slaughtered, the meat was given to the poor, who of course would say, "Why should I eat your sins?" But the entrails were put on the roof of the house. That's not done anymore, but that was the original custom for the demons. It was an offering to the demons, okay? Rabbi Joshua Trachtenberg, the late great rabbi of Temple Emeth in Teaneck, wrote the classic Jewish study called Jewish Magic and Superstition. It's been superseded to a certain extent, but the scholarship in that book has never been matched, and he has a whole thing about this. It's still in print.
Kapparis means something to you, it means nothing to me.
Kapparis. It comes from Kippur.
Why won't you say it's korban to God if it's on the roof?
No, it's not a korban to God. It's an offering to the demons, because you can't do a korban to God because there's no temple, right? Okay.
No, you're doing it symbolically.
It's not. It's definitely a demonic.
Anybody said that?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. It's actually, in fact, does say that. Okay. Take a look on page 252.
Next example.
This is the rules against magic. First in verse 26, you shall not practice divination or soothsaying. And then in verse 31 on the next page, it talks about not turning to ghosts and don't require spirits. And then elsewhere in the law code, you have even more. And of course, the offering to Moloch.
What's the verse on the next page?
Verse 31. In other words, if you go through the laws in Leviticus, there is very strong attack on magic and any magical practices of any kind, even more so than in Deuteronomy, interestingly enough. Yeah.
Just quick question. I know you explained it, but as far as the chronology, the priestly input here, how is it related to the Deuteronomy?
It depends on what part. Anything that's after chapter 19 is probably contemporary with the earlier level of Deuteronomy. Chapter 16 and 17 are earlier or later. It's a very complex editing. The point is that the P material goes through a series of editing and so on. But what you end up with, especially after H appears, and H is chapter 19 to the end of the book, you get this really strong reformist idea where you have the notion of holiness becomes the ideal, and therefore purity equals holiness, and purity also stands for life, and impurity stands for death. So here's
This is Deuteronomy.
yeah, this is Leviticus I'm talking about. But if you want to see again how the priestly people deal with this,
So the Deuteronomy school was picking on that on their.
well, it was like they were both kind of
Back and forth?
back and forth with each other. Again, and the Deuteronomy school is northern Israel, and the H is south, is Judean. Okay?
Because there's a temple
Because
there.
of the temple, right. In other words, it is specifically for the temple. Now, one of the things, there's a number of other rituals that are part and parcel of this. For one thing, the purification rituals for disease, right? The ones about skin diseases, about childbirth, about the about the appearance of what we would call mold in houses, which are in the Parshas Tazria Metzora. All of those were probably originally anti-demonological rituals, and they were transformed from the notion of the demonic to the notion of impurity. And by changing the category to purity versus impurity, it turns it into a monotheistic ritual. Because, and this Mary Douglas talks about this, by the way, in both her book on Leviticus and her book on Numbers, they couldn't do away with the rituals entirely. They couldn't come and say, you're not going to allow to do this anymore, because that was going too far. The people wouldn't stand for it. They felt when mold appeared in their house that the demons that, of course, caused, it was very unhealthy, right? And people would get sick. So the people felt that the source of illness were the demons. So they couldn't get away with knock out the rituals entirely. What they did was to transform it into a monotheistic ritual, or a strictly monotheistic ritual, from an anti-demonological one. And when you look, for example, there's a few other things like that in Numbers, where you have certain things. One second, you will see they also do that. The ritual of the woman suspected of adultery, right? Which is, hang on, I'm just forgetting offhand. That's one of a ritual where, yeah, here it is. It's in chapter 5. It's on page 290. What you have here, again, a woman is suspected of adultery, and she has to go through this whole ritual, which one could look at it and say, what is it? It's an ordeal ritual, right? You know what the ordeal is, right? I mean, they had them in the Middle Ages. Like, you suspect somebody of a witch, you throw them in a pond. If they float, they're a witch. If they sink to the bottom, they're not a witch, but of course they probably die. There's trial by combat to some extent is an ordeal. There was another ordeal where a person had to put their hand in boiling water, and they would watch how it healed, and so on and so forth. So the notion of an ordeal ritual is very widespread in human cultures, but it's magical. So what you have in chapter 5, again, verse 11 on page 290, the ritual of the sota, the woman who is suspected of adultery, it's an ordeal ritual where she is made to drink something that has got to ground up a series of curses from a scroll, and so on and so forth. And if she gets sick, she is guilty. If she doesn't, she isn't. This is blatant magic. This is an ordeal ritual. But what do they do to it? They couldn't get rid of it. Again, it's done, first of all, not by anybody, but by the priest at the sanctuary, right? The priest is the one in control. And the priest is the one who puts the curses down in writings. In other words, as magical as it is all contained within the stricter monotheistic control of the priest. Okay? So that's another example of a ritual that is obviously a magical ritual, where the priestly tradition knew they couldn't get rid of it because the people would feel this existential need for these rituals, but they could reduce the magical element in it and transform it to a more strictly monotheistic idea.
Not existential.
What?
It's not existential, it's pragmatic.
Well, existential in the sense that it fulfills not what I would call a logical need, but a emotional need.
Burning down the house because the fungus has destroyed it?
Well, it's not. It's actually taking it down. You're right. There are aspects of it that are, but you know what it is, though? If it's all coming from God rather than the demons, then to a certain extent, it's again, why is God doing this to me? See, that's That's the problem with strict monotheism. It raises the theodicy issue of why is God punishing me? Because with demons, God isn't punishing you, right? So that's sort of the, I don't know, unintended consequences of stricter monotheism is it creates the theodicy problem.
So
Okay?
how did he make this more monotheistic?
Well, by putting it under the control of the priests, by eliminating any reference to demons attacking her. The first one we talked about, though, was Jordan, you hadn't come in yet, was the Yom Kippur ritual and Azazel and how they got rid of all of that. So,
Can I suggest?
yeah,
a question?
sure.
So the big picture, the big map here.
Yeah,
So there's a layer of demons versus God with a higher power.
yeah.
Which becomes like pure monotheism.
Right.
What's underneath that?
Well, the point is...
Not paganism.
Well, no, but the demons never go away. In other words, people continue to believe in
But
them.
what, like you said, the religions of Israel. So what they were underneath it.
Well, the original religions, as we talked about in the first lectures, is they believed in demons. They believed in magic. They believed
Not
in...
gods of different areas. That was
No. They weren't pagans.
What's the difference?
Well, they were monotheistic in a broader sense, remember, that they believed that God was the main God, but there were demigods, there were angels, there were demons. In other words, there were lesser powers
And what's
that were
what's the-
sometimes acting independently, especially the demons, of God. The stricter monotheists, they want to do away with all of that. They want to say there's just God. So the Deuteronomy people never mention angels.
So is there any other culture around the same time that had a similar development?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. And the point that I want to make is that the revolution succeeds to a certain extent, but it also fails. Because the demons in popular practice never go away. And what happens is, and the angels, who undoubtedly had all kinds of names attached to them originally, but in the Torah, none of the angels have names. In fact, in the entire Tanakh, except in the book of Daniel, which is very late, the angels don't have names, right? But what happens is that in the Second Temple period, this whole idea of the demonic realm bubbles up back to the surface, so to speak, in the literature. The angels, an elaborate angelology develops with all kinds of names of angels. Certain forms of magic are deemed legitimate as opposed to illegitimate. And then by the Talmudic period, the rabbis are doing this little dance as to what magic is permissible and what is not, given the rules against magic in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But the fact is, until the rise of, until the modern period, the vast majority of Jews believed in demons, magic, this whole angel system, and amulets, spells, all kinds of things like that.
Until the modern period?
Till the modern period.
My mother wouldn't stitch on a button unless she...
Yes, of course. Well, yes, there's always... There's, yes,
You say a brain.
the elimination of this primarily occurs in Western Europe with the Enlightenment and the growth of modern science. But you're right. Eastern European Jewry still had a lot of this. But again, they go through a modernizing period, but magical thinking never completely goes away. The point is, the only people who didn't believe in this stuff before the modern age were Philo and the Jewish philosophers in the Middle Ages, like Maimonides and Ibn Ezra. But you're talking about a tiny, tiny group of people relative to the general people. And as I mentioned before, Maimonides was condemned in his own day and up until today for his obvious disbelief in demons. Because if it's in the Talmud, then it must be true, right? Okay, so the priestly religion had its own way of doing this a revolution, this against this kind of popular or basic Israelite Judean religion. The Deuteronomy people did it through their way, which was not so ritualistic. The people incorporated it into the ritual. They reformed the ritual to cleanse it of the demonic and the magical elements.
Which is the original Reformed Judaism.
Whatever you want to say is
I
like.
tell you, I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
it wasn't, if you say that rhetoric, you pretty much got the same rhetoric.
Okay,
of the 19th
well,
century
you know,
Reform movement.
well, the thing that Geller talks about is, was this a reformation or a revolution? Was it evolution or revolution? And it's a little bit of both, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened over hundreds of years to some extent. So one could say it's an evolution. But on the other hand, it's pretty radical about what the D and the P people were doing or tried to do. And so on some ways, you can also call it a reformation or a revolution, okay? Because it had a huge impact, because after all, everything they wanted ended up in the Tanakh, right? They're the ones who edit the Torah. They're the ones who edit the whole historical books.
So
The P and the D people, right? In other words, in terms of what ends up as sacred literature that ends up becoming the template for all of Judaism, they won. The thing is, though, the other stuff just didn't go away and survived in eschatological and apocalyptic stuff. Seth Schwartz, who wrote he's a historian, wrote a very fine book on Second Temple Judaism, points out that in some of these Second Temple documents, you see this more purified monotheism side by side with this almost dualistic apocalyptic idea. The one is the covenant and the purity of the covenant, and then all of a sudden in the same document, they will talk about the realms of the demonic ruling the world. Because in the Second Temple period, the apocalyptic literature, some of them said, look, God's not really ruling the world at the moment. The demons are ruling the world. God will eventually come and set things right, but at the moment, the reason why you see all this evil and suffering and the suppression of the Jewish people is because the demons are ruling the world.
Is that the influence of Gnosticism also?
No, that Gnosticism later. We're talking about, well, it could be all kinds of things. Could be Zoroastrianism, but the point is that the survival of the demonic becomes really to the fore in the Second Temple period as almost in some circles, a dualistic theology, that there's the realm of evil and the realm of good, and for the moment, the realm of evil is winning. Right? Okay. The last thing I want to say about P is that what it underlies the entire ritual system is the victory of life over death. I mean, that's the point. That death on some theological level is a challenge to the power of God. Because if God really is all-powerful, then there shouldn't be death. And this is how eschatology eventually says God will kill death eventually even, right? So the priestly tradition, all of their rituals, the underlying theology is the attempt to bring the victory of life over death. And so improper emissions of blood and infections and skin diseases are representative of death. And notice, a dead body is the highest source of impurity, right? So anything that is dead, anything that seems to suggest death is impure. And you need to bring it back to the realm of life. And one of the, of course, main ways you do that is through two things. You wash it in water, in living water, fresh water, mayim chaim, because water is that which purges away dirt and sin. It's the reason for the flood, right? And then blood, which paradoxically, if spilt incorrectly, represents death, but if used in a proper way, represents life, because as it says in Leviticus, the life is in the blood. So the blood ritual is this paradoxical thing where the spilling of the blood of an animal in the proper way, in fact, brings life. The spilling of a human blood improperly, through murder, through attack, through bodily emissions, brings death. Right?
Whose theory is that?
This is Milgram. This is, if you read Milgram's introduction to Leviticus, he gives you the whole, lays it all out. And I think he absolutely makes his case on this. He's not the only one, but I mean, he's like the chief proponent of it, Jacob Milgram.
Yeah.
Okay, any final questions about P before we go to the wisdom tradition?
Would it seem, in view of all we know today, that death will no longer be impure, and that, Kohanim can go to a cemetery? I mean, it's...
Well, actually, they're not supposed to.
I know, that's what I mean.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point, Sam. Our tradition is not comfortable with the idea of death. We try to negate the death, as I said, in some ways as a challenge to the omnipotence of God. We don't see death as good or necessary. We see it as bad.
See it as failure.
What?
Failure.
Well, to some extent, right? And that's why we have ideas of, one second, Paul. That's why we have ideas about the afterlife, right? That everything that, will be set right, and eventually there will be no death. And as we know from modern biology, death is necessary. It's absolutely necessary for life. In evolution, in just in the normal functioning of the biological systems, and in fact, even on a cosmological level, the early stars of the universe had to blow up in order to create carbon that was the basis for life itself. I actually wrote a whole article about this where I struggled personally between this Jewish notion of the negation of death and the necessity of death as an environmentalist, and I tried to grapple with it on both a theological and a personal level. If you're interested in the piece, I'd be happy to send it to you. Yes, Paul?
If there was no death, which they say is the ultimate, we'd be fighting for space.
Yes, and
So if there's death, there's space for new life.
yeah, and not only that, but the old would dominate the young. There'd be no new ideas, and that's why there are groups that are attempting to create technologies or genetic engineering to produce the ability of people to live more than 200 years, and this many people feel would be a really bad thing for the earth and for humanity. I don't want to get any further into that, but my favorite philosopher, Hans Jonas, once wrote an article on which the piece that I talked about, my pieces are partly based on, called The Burden and the Blessing of Mortality. That mortality can be a burden because you can die before your time, so to speak, but it can be a blessing because of the necessity for what Paul talked about, but also even the new generation of ideas and all kinds of things. It's a wonderful piece. Jonas wrote it in his, it was one of the last things he wrote, actually, before he died. And I know from his late wife, she just passed away this past year, he was not afraid of death. He accepted it, the idea of death as necessary and as
What was
important.
the title of the book?
It's not a book, it's an article called The Burden and the Blessing of Mortality, or it's either that or The Blessing and the Burden of Mortality. It was published in the Hastings Center report. But if you're interested, I can get you a copy of it. All right, yes, Jordan, and then I want to go on to the wisdom tradition.
So how do you fit like the life after death kind of picture into this? Does it fit in? Because what I remember you saying is that the earlier form of Israelite religion
Did believe in that.
did believe in life after death, and that then is it the D source and the P source that suppress that?
Well,
And then are they
the answer I got from Ben Summer was they just don't like to talk about it. Okay?
They don't talk about it, but basically they leave it out.
Yeah, they leave it out.
So if they leave it out, is that because it's in many ways less monotheistic.
Yes,
the realm of the
yes,
dead, the
yes,
demons,
exactly.
all this stuff, but it's also what effectively is the death of death. In other words, is the afterlife.
You know what it is? It was obvious that it was so deeply ingrained. They couldn't, there's nothing in it that says, there is no life after death, right? But they were very uncomfortable with the whole cult of the dead. that obviously existed, that you would go to the graves and you'd bring food and all. I mean, and that you would pray to your ancestors' spirit and then you would feed them, They were very uncomfortable with this, so there's a suggestion in the material that they tried to do away with that, but it's very unclear. Scholars are really torn over whether they actually forbade the practices or not. Ben Summers' opinion is that they just were so uncomfortable with it, they just didn't talk about it. They couldn't talk about it. And, he's probably right, because there's nothing about it.
Well, it's also it's part of what they were trying to get rid of. It sounds like.
Yeah, but they didn't but they didn't
like,
prohibit it like they did so many other things. You see, so that's why Summers says that they just didn't want to deal with it.
Right. Last thing on this whole thing, the Reform movement in the 19th century. What's really fascinating is you can link the two together because the Reform movement, when the original thinkers were essentially saying, we're going to bring Judaism back
to a pure biblical absolutely
biblical idea. But whose biblical idea was it? It was the PD biblical idea, which was the
it was more the D than the P because they did away with a lot of ritual too, right?
Complicated. Yes, I agree with that. But they were very much, the idea was pure monotheism, right? That was that whole ethical monotheism, and effectively looked at what happened after that as these sort of medieval accretions and sort of this demons and superstitions.
But that was the Protestant critique. They got that out of Protestantism. Protestantism claimed it was going back to a pure primitive church by doing away with the church hierarchies and the rituals. And the Protestant Bible scholars thought exactly the same thing about the religion of Israel, namely that the original Israel was the pure monotheism of the prophets. This is the monotheism that Jesus knew, and the ritual and the priestly tradition is late, and it's exactly what the Jewish reformers, they in effect accepted that critique and said all this ritual stuff is later and it comes in from the outside and it's not the original, pure monotheism of the prophets, which was also the pure tradition of the early church. So there's a lot of that, and of course we know that's just not what happened. Okay, let's go to the wisdom tradition.
What do you mean? That's not what happened to Christianity? No,
that's not what happened in Israelite religion. I mean, they completely mischaracterized what the people were and the dating of all this stuff. And even in terms of the early church, their critique of the early church, the church very quickly, when it went from the Jesus followers to Christianity, moved into the area of hierarchy and ritual. It was a very early phenomenon. Okay, this is not about Christianity.
No, but I was saying it sounds like, though, that I'm talking about the Jewish, and I don't know so much about the Protestant.
Yeah.
There's a link. But the understanding of, what the D school was doing is what they were latching on to.
Yeah, of course, but also the prophets. If you look at it, they're real big on the prophets.
The prophets are part of that school.
Right, because they assumed that the prophetic critique of the cult meant that they didn't like sacrifice, which is wrong.
Well, they were wrong, right?
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so let's go on to the wisdom tradition. So the last of our religions of Israel is the wisdom tradition. So if you look on page 2 of the material here, what are our sources in the Bible? Our sources is the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, the book of Ecclesiastes, even though it's quite late, and a bunch of Psalms. And the list here is kind of the maximal list of Psalms. There are people who restrict it to a smaller group of Psalms. But if you take a look at E, there are post-biblical wisdom sources.
Rabbi, on the Psalms, which would the key ones be rather than the maximum list?
119, 19, few others. 49.
How do you identify them? By the topic?
Yeah, by the way, they're the whole ethic underlying them and the fact they actually use a lot of the wisdom language, okay, which I'll show you. But there is post-biblical wisdom literature, stuff that didn't make it into the Bible but is completely part of the wisdom school, namely the book of Ben Sira, which many of you have studied with me, the Wisdom of Solomon, which is a book actually written in Greek originally, but is definitely a wisdom book. There are texts in the Qumran material that are very clearly wisdom material. Philo exhibits a great deal of wisdom influence, and Pirkei Avot is the rabbinic collection of wisdom material, very much heavily influenced. If you look, for example, how many times in Pirkei Avot they actually quote the book of Proverbs, it's quite significant. And I would say that a number of the sayings of Jesus are really in the style of wisdom material as well. The aphorisms, the parables, that's really our wisdom material. So the question is, what is wisdom? Well, let's take a look, and where does it come from? Let's take a look first of all to give you an example of kind of where it lies. To Jeremiah chapter 18. Verse 18, which is on page 1056. Jeremiah is, of course, as I pointed out to you, there's a lot of people who do not like what he's doing, right? And to the point where he barely escapes with his life. Cal, do you want to read verse 18?
They said, "Come, let us devise a plot against Jeremiah. For instruction shall not fail from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor oracle from the prophet. Come, let us strike him with the tongue, and we shall no longer have to listen to all those words of his."
In other words, we're going to slander him so that he becomes somebody who nobody will listen to. But notice they list three kinds of groups. The Torah of the priests, right? So Torah is associated with the Kohanim teaching, which we know, right? That's the term in Deuteronomy. That becomes the term that is known for the teachings that come out of priestly circles. We'll forget the Chachamim, V'davar minavi, prophecy, oracle from the prophet. So there are the prophets, right? And notice it says, Eitzah me Chacham, counsel from the Chacham. This shows you the three different groups within Israelite society.
Sorry, you're still on 18?
Yeah, the priests, the prophets, and the Chachamim, the wise men. Now, who are the wise men? Well, if you take a look on page 3, G, you will see they are, first of all, the scribes, the ones who were literate, the people who knew how to write, because very few people knew how to write, and so writing was, for the most part, a profession, right? This was true in all ancient societies. Of course, because Hebrew was an alphabetic language, it was a heck of a lot easier to learn how to become a scribe in Israel than in Egypt, where you had to learn hundreds of hieroglyphics. You spent 10 years learning how to read and write in Egypt. So the point is, the scribes, the actual people who wrote things down. That doesn't mean there weren't literate priests or prophets, but generally speaking, there was a group of people who wrote stuff down. Now, from that group, they weren't just secretaries, they were administrators. And when you look at the lists in the book of Samuel's or in Chronicles of David or Solomon's administration, they list the names of people who are the scribe, the official scribe and the administrators of various kinds. So the wisdom tradition comes out of the literate group and the court administration. We know this from some of the topics that are covered in wisdom material. They are directed at young men who are coming into and want to become bureaucrats in the royal administration. Okay?
Which period are you talking now?
We're talking the late First Temple. Late First Temple. We know that they are therefore become teachers. Some of them, the wisdom people, became teachers. In other words, they set up, maybe, again, this is a contentious issue, maybe some of them set up formal schools. Ben Sira had a school. He mentions it. So Ben Sira dates to around the year 200 BCE. We know that there were formal schools by the wisdom teachers for students to come to learn how to read, how to write, how to properly conduct yourself at the court, how to become a good administrator, but in the process also learning the virtues of the wisdom tradition, the way to live a good life. We know, therefore, if there were teachers, there were students, right? And another area where the Israelite wisdom tradition seems to come from are the village elders, men and women, fathers and mothers in particular. There's a whole strain within the book of Proverbs, not just about court ideas, but also what we would call folk wisdom from the villages, agriculture, how to properly maintain sustainable agriculture, we would say. So this is where the wisdom literature comes from. It's not from the priests, it's not from the prophets, it's from a whole other group or groups. That doesn't mean that some of the priests and some of the prophets were not influenced by this. And as I said, Jeremiah shows a certain influence. The writers of Deuteronomy there's a certain influence. Again, you're talking about small groups of people here, so they're interacting with each other.
But the scribes were not priests?
No, I'm sure there were literate priests, but the scribes were, generally speaking, were a non-priestly group. They didn't have to be. They weren't, right? The priests had their own teachings that they preserved. Again, some of them were undoubtedly literate and they wrote it down, but originally it was all pretty much oral, Okay, so let's find out. I've used this word wisdom. In Hebrew, it's Chokhmah. Let's learn what Chokhmah is. So first of all, turn to the beginning of the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is, assigned to Solomon because when it talks about Solomon in the book of Samuel, it talks how he was the wisest. In other words, Solomon becomes the prototype of the Chacham. He is supposed to have composed Proverbs, and he was wise beyond everything. He knew about all the animals and the species. As you will see, that's very important in wisdom literature, the natural world. The point is that Solomon is the ideal Chacham to the wisdom school. So they assigned him the authorship of the book of Proverbs. In fact, we know that the book of Proverbs is a collection with, from various sources. It went through a composition over a couple hundred years. So it wasn't written by a single author. It's more of an anthology. Okay? So take a look at verse 7. Cal, do you want to read that? It's on page 1599.
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and discipline.
This is in effect the title of the book. In order to gain Chokhmah, and the word Chokhmah, there are synonyms for it like Dea and other words, Eitzah. It says Reshit Yirat Adonai Reshit Da'at. Da'at Chokhmah. Okay? What is Yirat Adonai? Fear of the Lord? It's moral consciousness. You have to know the difference between right and wrong. That's the foundation of Chokhmah. If you don't have that, you don't have wisdom.
Is that, as we say, a wise guy?
Well, the word Chacham in Yiddish typically can mean the opposite of its real meaning. It can mean an idiot. In Yiddish, to call somebody a Chacham can mean an idiot. But it's one of those things where the real meaning is it's sarcastic, Okay. But the original Chacham is not a wise guy, is a teacher of real life wisdom. It's not knowledge, it's wisdom. And I think that's the distinction is knowledge is facts. Wisdom is not just about facts, but about life experience and how to live the good life. Okay?
Is it also how to use those facts?
Yes, how to use them to create the good life. So,
So you wouldn't agree with it. This translation is not good. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's
yeah.
the beginning of wisdom.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's really, well, the beginning of knowledge, but it's a synonym here for wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. And what you find in the book of Proverbs and in Ecclesiastes is the opposite of the wise is the fool, the one who despises this and ends up in a terrible place. Right? And you'll see it. They go off, and this is aimed at some of these young administrators. You know, if you follow Chokhmah, you'll have a good life. If you don't, you will go off, you'll become a drunkard, you'll lose all your money, you'll end up in the gutter, you know, you'll end up going to prostitutes. I mean, you know, there's a lot of that. And in fact, if you look at 8, it talks about it says, my son, heed the discipline. Again, musar here, the notion that Chokhmah, the life of Chokhmah has a certain discipline to it, and do not forsake the Torah of your mother. Again, this is where this wisdom comes from your parents, is one of the sources of it. All right, take a look at chapter 3. The whole first part of Proverbs is a later, up to the end of chapter 9, was really added later to the rest of the book. But take a look at chapter 3, verse...
I know it was added later.
What? The language and various other things, they know that it's a prologue, so to speak, on the rest of the book. Take a look at verse 13. What you have here is, you see in the English translation and in the Hebrew, they're put into a series of paragraphs. That's because these are separate little pieces. And in the later part of the book of Proverbs, very often it's just like 2 lines. They're aphorism after aphorism after aphorism, proverbs and so on, right?
So in a scroll, there are going to be spaces?
No, not necessarily, but this is what the scholars have done. So it's pretty evident that verses 13 to 18 are like a separate little composition. So, Jordan, you want to read verses 13 to 18? You'll find something are quite well known here.
Sounds like Asher's Kyle, isn't it?
Yeah,
No, it's not. Eshachai is at the end of the book of Proverbs.
She is more precious than rubies.
Yeah, well, that's a phrase that's used, but Eshachai actually comes from the book of Proverbs.
This is in our literature.
Yeah, go ahead.
Happy is the man who finds wisdom, the man who attains understanding. Her value in trade is better than silver, her yield greater than gold. She is more precious than rubies. All of your goods cannot equal her. In her right hand is length of days, and her left riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths peaceful. She is a tree of life to those who grasp her, and whoever holds on to her is happy.
What is the central theme here? If you gain Chokhmah, you become Ashrei, happy. True happiness in life comes from the acquisition of wisdom, which tells you how to live, right? And therefore, it's better than material goods. But notice what it says. In her right hand is length of days. You'll live longer because you won't dissipate yourself by becoming an alcoholic and all that kind of stuff. And in her left, riches and honor. You will learn how to properly maintain your wealth and thereby grow your wealth rather than dissipate it. And by learning wisdom, you will become honored in the eyes of other people as a virtuous person and a wise person. So this tells you exactly what wisdom is for. And notice it's a she.
Yes.
Because Chokhmah is a feminine verb. And that becomes critical in a later chapter where wisdom has a soliloquy. And she is Lady Wisdom. Speaks in chapter 8. Right? We'll get back to chapter 8. But the point is, this is a lovely little poem that encapsulates what wisdom is, what Chokhmah is. If you go look at the next poem,
Well, sorry, the liturgy is clearly saying equals Torah.
that happens later. We'll get to that. That happens later.
But the rabbis did that.
Yeah, no, it happened long before the rabbis. It happened.
It's in here.
It's in here. No, it's not in here.
Well, they use the word Torah, don't they?
No, they don't really use the word Torah. Anytime it shows up in Proverbs, it just means teaching, but they don't really use it. What's interesting is that of the use of the metaphor of the tree of life. After chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis, the tree of life never shows up again explicitly, except in the book of Proverbs as a metaphor. There are allusions to it in Ezekiel and a couple other places, but the only explicit references to the tree of life are used in the book of Proverbs. And here, Chokhmah is a tree, an Eitz Chaim. And what is the Eitz Chaim in the Garden of Eden? If you eat from the fruit of the Eitz Chaim, you'll become immortal. Right? That's why God kicked them out of the garden. The Eitz Chaim is the source, is the conduit between heaven and earth in the garden that brings blessing to the world. So it obviously was well known. Here they are saying, in effect, if you acquire Chokhmah, it's like the tree of life. Okay? And again, the word for happiness, ashrei, is critical. And ashrei is not happy the way it is commonly understood today. Today, most people use the word to mean an emotional state, right?
Which word is that?
Happy.
Happy, okay.
In fact, a more traditional that's a very modern idea, by the way. Happiness in a more traditional way means well-being. And well-being is not only of the individual, but within the matrix of society. So when Thomas Jefferson wrote the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, in the Declaration of Independence, he meant the second term, not the first. He wasn't talking about individual gratification, emotional gratification. He was talking about individual and societal well-being. That is the well-established philosophical definition of happiness. It's what the wisdom literature means by it. The scholar Chava Tirosh Samuelson of Arizona State University wrote a whole book on the notion of happiness in Judaism. And traces it from the biblical ideas to it starts off with the Greek ideas, the biblical ideas, and the Jewish philosophical tradition, the mystical tradition. There's a long history of this word, ashrei, and how do you attain it. Yeah.
So wisdom, Chokhmah, is not knowledge.
Not facts.
Right, it's not fact, and it's not intellect.
No.
Because you can acquire it.
You can acquire it, but of course it helps to have intellect, and facts are part of it. But it's also part of a life experience. Okay? Now, in verse 19, and we'll get back to that, Chokhmah, notice what it says. The Lord founded the earth by wisdom. He established the heavens by understanding. Remember that. That's very important. That's verse 19. So, if you want to see another sort of important little text on wisdom, go to chapter 28 of the book of Job, which is on page 1698. This is a hymn to wisdom that's interpolated into the book of Job. Most scholars believe it was added in by a later editor. Some don't, but most believe, for whatever reason, the final editor of the book of Job, who did not write most of it, put this wisdom poem in there. Okay? And it is. It's a hymn to wisdom. And it begins with a long thing about how humans have this technology for digging deep in the earth to find silver and gold and all kinds of things. And that goes all the way to verse 11. But then it says, but where can wisdom be found? Where is the source of understanding? And then in effect it says, humans can't find it. You can't dig it out of the earth. It cannot be, this is on page 1699, you cannot barter it for gold, right? Then, and it repeats itself in verse 20, But whence does wisdom come? Where is the source of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living, concealed, and even the realm of death don't know where it is. Abaddon and death. God understands the way to it. He knows its source. And so the point is, only God has true Chokhmah. And if you look at the end, on the next page, on page 1700, it says that God says to man, see, fear of the Lord is wisdom. To shun evil is understanding. In other words, moral and ethical consciousness and behavior is the beginning, is the true beginning of Chokhmah. And that's what Chokhmah is about. It's about learning to live the good and virtuous life. And from that, you will then be happy and honored and so on and so forth. And, you know, if you look at some of these Psalms, you'll see there are many examples of it. Psalm 128 is about, you know, again, about how fear of the Lord brings you happiness and you have family and you live to be a grandparent and, you know, you eat the work of your own hands. Psalm 49, let's look at that briefly. It's quite
Can you talk about the ura itself? What does it mean?
Yeah, well, it means fear of the Lord in a literal sense, but in a deeper sense, it means moral consciousness.
Does it, yeah, because I had the same question, is, in the wisdom literature, is there a reward punishment theology?
Yeah, there
Or
is.
more rhetoric?
Well, no, you'll see that's one of its problems. Psalm 49 on page 1470 is a traditional psalm that is 1470 is recited at a shiva, right? You go through a service, you say Aleinu, you say the mourner's Kaddish, and then you recite Psalm 49. A lot of modern prayer books have added other psalms or have eliminated because if you read it, most people don't bother to read what it says. It can be pretty hard.
It's, yeah, in the Reform, it's not there.
Yeah.
The point is, it's a wisdom psalm. It's a wisdom psalm, right?
No, right?
It basically says that nothing you do in your life, all the riches you accrue means nothing because you're going to die and you end up like a beast in the grave, right?
Impressive.
But it's good. It's good for the living. It's a good.
In other words, it's trying to say to you, it's like Ecclesiastes in many ways. No, it's not grim. It's trying to face up the fact that
Yeah.
you're going to die, right? And you have to learn to be, you know, wisdom is more important than accruing riches, because what's going to happen to your riches? Well, somebody else is going to get them, right? I mean, whoever wrote Psalm 49 is, you know, basically very similar attitudes to the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay, let's
It's a
go.
great line. I mean, these are really, this
Yeah.
is great wisdom. Do not be afraid when a man becomes rich, when his household goes
Exactly.
to Greece, for when he dies, he can take nothing.
Right,
He
exactly.
can't take it with
In
you.
other words, exactly. Okay, let's go on. So the word Chokhmah can mean wisdom. It has other meanings in the Tanakh. It can mean skill, like in war, or craft, like a craftsman. It can mean wisdom administration. It can mean shrewdness. It can mean prudence. It can mean ethical. It's used 153 times in the Tanakh. The word Chokhmah shows up. 84 of those are in the book of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes.
84 out of what?
84 out of 153 are in Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, the wisdom books. It shows up a bunch of times. Of course, it's mentioned in Psalms, but if you go through the list of how many, no other places is it as much as in the wisdom books themselves. Okay? Now, what's interesting about wisdom literature is that it's international. In other words, long before the book of Proverbs was written, long before the Israelite wisdom schools, there were wisdom schools in Egypt, even as far back as Sumer and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And we have books. These are a few of the ancient books of wisdom. And you see the dating on this stuff. This is long before the Israelites even appeared on the scene. So what it is, it's an international literature. And in fact, you see the one that's called the Instructions of Amen Nenhat. There is a chunk of the book of Proverbs that essentially comes from that Egyptian book. How did it get into the book of Proverbs? The Egyptian book must have been translated into Aramaic at some point, and the writers of the collectors of Proverbs took those Proverbs in Aramaic and translated them into Hebrew. But they're almost exact quotes from this earlier Egyptian work.
At the present time, Rabbi, we call that plagiarism.
No, it's not plagiarism. It's, again, this stuff was passing around all over the place. All right? It's like folk tales, you know? So
From which Egyptian book? I'm looking.
the Instructions of Amen Nenhat, okay? The point is that it's an international literature. It's not specifically Israelite or Jewish. And that's one of its most fascinating characteristics, that if you look in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the fate of the nation is not talked about. The covenant is not talked about. It's much more individualistic. That's one of its interesting ideas. It's about the individual. It's not about the nation. It's not about the clan. It's directed to the individual. It's very intellectual, not ritual. It rarely talks about the cult, virtually none. Okay? It's intellectual. A lot of it is training the young. That's why the whole first part of Proverbs is it's done almost as a my son. It's all about training the young. It's the older wisdom teachers training the young, meaning mostly the young men who want to go into, the administration, but also learning how to live life properly. As I mentioned before, you basically have several sources of wisdom. Part of it comes from the clan or the family. Again, the folk, the village wisdom. There's a number of things. I've given you some examples there that have to do with kind of agriculture and maintaining your flocks and all that kind of thing. There's court wisdom, how to properly behave in the court. You see this especially in Ecclesiastes. And there is what we call existential reflection. I will get back to that. A lot of it is practical wisdom, maxims for correct living that produces prosperity and esteem and happiness. That's the vast majority of it. However, there's also speculative or existential reflection, philosophical and religious issues such as suffering and theodicy. The book of Job is the prime example of that, but also it's found in Ecclesiastes. What's fascinating is that the author of Job and the author of Ecclesiastes, although part of the whole wisdom tradition, in a way they're dissenting from it. Because as Jordan pointed out, there is a kind of moral determinism in wisdom, that if you just know how to live properly, everything will be fine with you. Your life will be good. But the author of Job and the author of Ecclesiastes say, what the heck are you talking about? Now, they're doing this from within the tradition, within the wisdom tradition. They're dissenting from the kind of, Proverbs is the mainstream, and so is the book of Ben Sira, by the way. That's kind of the mainstream wisdom. Job and Ecclesiastes are the radical dissent. But again, in Ecclesiastes, you find a lot of maxims for living. In other words, he doesn't give up on it entirely. He just tries to point out the limitations of it. But one of the key elements of wisdom literature is the notion of creation and how important this is. If you take a look at Proverbs chapter 8, we're not going to look at the whole chapter, but This is the second last chapter in the prologue, and it's on page 1611. Wisdom begins to speak. Lady Wisdom. She starts in verse 4, right? And what does she do? She first of all talks about how important it is to attain her, because she will teach you how to live the virtuous life. She has truth, and so on. If you look in verse 12, I, wisdom, live with prudence. I attain knowledge and foresight. To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride, arrogance, the evil way, and duplicity in speech, right? So that's the negative things you're trying to avoid, right? Mine are counsel and resources. I am understanding. Courage is mine. Through me kings reign and rulers decree just laws. In other words, I am at the heart of a orderly society. Great men and all the righteous judges, those who love me I love, and those who seek me will find me. Riches and honor belong to me, enduring wealth and success. In other words, you follow me and you will have riches and honor. My fruit is better than gold, fine gold, my produce better than choice silver. I walk on way of righteousness, on paths of justice. So there's an intimate connection between being a just, ethical person and the acquisition of wisdom, and so on. But now, take a look at...
And wealth.
Yes, that's the point. You cannot buy wisdom, but if you follow wisdom, you are more likely to obtain wealth, because you will learn prudence and proper way to manage your resources.
Right.
Okay?
Kind of the gospel of wealth here.
Well, no, it's not automatic. It's not automatic, okay? But take a look at verse 22. Irma, do you want to start reading that?
The Lord created me?
Yeah.
The Lord created me at the beginning of his course, as the first of his works of old. In the distant past, I was fashioned, at the beginning, at the origin of earth. There was still no deep when I was brought forth, no springs rich in water. Before the foundation of the mountains were sunk, before the hills, I was born. He had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first clumps of clay. I was there when he set the heaven into place, when he fixed the horizon upon the deep, when he made the heavens above firm and the fountains of the deep gushed forth, when he assigned the sea its limits, so that its waters never transgress his command. When he fixed the foundations of the earth, I was with him as a confidant, a source of delight every day, rejoicing before him at all times, rejoicing in his inhabited world, finding delight with mankind.
Now, we'll stop here for a second, because the rest of it, this part then says, again, listen to me, sons, happy are those who keep my ways, and so on and so forth. But what is Chokhmah then? Chokhmah is the design of the universe, the order of the universe. In effect, God created the plans, the architectural plans, by creating Chokhmah before the creation of the world itself. And notice how she is a confidant, an amon. That word has many different meanings, and a source of delight. It's almost like they played together, right? Some would even go so far as to say she is a co-creator, but I don't think that's what the text says. So, when you study Chokhmah, how do you obtain Chokhmah? You study the natural world. Part of obtaining Chokhmah is studying the natural world, because by learning the order of creation, you learn the design, and you learn to live in harmony with the universe by learning the workings of the natural world. And in the wisdom literature, there is a lot of use of natural imagery.
I assume it's where Maimonides gets this as well.
Yes. Maimonides, to a certain extent, he is also a descendant of this.
The mystics get the whole notion of Torah.
Yeah.
See, it's the creation of the world.
Well, actually, the rabbi, you'll see this in a minute. It's long before all of that. Okay, but the point is that part of the speculative, existential, theological part of Chokhmah, aside from the practical part, is this notion that Chokhmah is the design behind creation. And if you learn to study the natural world and you learn what the order of creation is, you will learn to live in harmony with creation, and that will give you a good life. Practically speaking, if you're a farmer, if you have flocks, you learn how to deal with the rains and so on and so forth. So, in other words, there is a creation theology in this that's completely different. I mean, it utilizes some of the old themes of, the old cosmic themes of God struggling with the primordial waters. It shows up in Job as well. But the point is that it's not mythic in that sense. But there's a definite creation theology that the world was created by means. I wrote here by wisdom, not created by wisdom, but by means of wisdom.
It sounds very much like a goddess.
Well, there's a lot of people who think that Chokhmah, in fact, is kind of the remnant of the goddess who was the consort of God, but I doubt it. They're really, But what's interesting is that in Greek, in later Jewish Greek literature, and in the New Testament, she becomes Sophia. All right, in Greek, she becomes Sophia.
Why do you doubt that? Because we've seen these things come back and forth.
When you read through the literature, there's a good argument for saying it's not. The point is that what you end up with is a unity of the natural and moral order. And this is where Ecclesiastes and Job is dissenting from this. But the mainstream wisdom is about the unity of the natural and moral orders.
This is very similar to Native American beliefs in terms of, you study nature.
Right.
And you.
So when you look at the wisdom school, you see how radically different it is from the Israelite Judean common religion. There's no hint of magic at all in any of this. No talk of angels, no talk of demons. They really don't mention the cult virtually at all. As I said, there's nothing about the covenant between Israel and God. It's all about the individual, not the group. It's a very radically intellectual, cosmopolitan way of looking at the world. It's not against the cult. I mean, but you can see that the wisdom teachers, sacrifices for them were not really that important, very likely. For them, it was it's very intellectual. The study, the learning how to, to live right, and so on and so forth.
So how did you place them historically?
Well, it's late. It's sort of late. Proverbs is sort of late First Temple times, but some of the material obviously goes back much further. So you get some of these earlier folk wisdoms and things, but it coalesces, I think, in the latter part of the First Temple period.
Do you think it was continually interspersed with the theodicy people, with the people who believed in sacrifice, and there was a continual dialogue going on?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's very clear that Deuteronomy rejects this lack of connection to covenant. And what you see in Deuteronomy is you see the beginning, the very, very early beginnings of the integration of the notion of Chokhmah and Torah.
In Deuteronomy.
Yeah. I said here Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is an example of this integration, where Chokhmah and Torah become identified with one another. Okay? And this is a way of the covenant people kind of taking over the wisdom people and integrating them into their system. And by the 2nd century BCE, that integration, that's the alarm, okay? That integration is complete, right? And you see it in chapter 24 of Ben Sira.
What is that?
2nd century BCE. In other words, I don't think he started it.
Yeah, Rabbi, I told you I'll turn it.
Okay. I don't think Ben Sira started it. But the fact is, I think it's part of an evolution that starts with Deuteronomy. I think you see it a bit in Psalm 119. maybe also in Psalm 19. But the point is, what happens is that by the time of Ben Sira, if you look at chapter 24 of the book of Ben Sira, there is a very explicit identification of Chokhmah and Torah. And the rabbis, by the time of the rabbis, this is now normative. And there's a very famous midrash at the beginning of the book of Midrash Rabbah, which utilizes these verses from the chapter 8 of the book of Proverbs to, in effect, show that identification. Okay? So, and that's what happens throughout the later Jewish tradition. But originally, they're not the same. Okay? And what's interesting is that the book of Ecclesiastes, written about 100 years or so before Ben Sira, he is a guy who rejects this integration of Torah and Chokhmah, even while he is reflecting contemporary Greek philosophical schools such as Stoicism and Epicureanism. In other words, yeah, the book of Ecclesiastes is written around 300 or earlier. The point is, the author of Ecclesiastes, on one hand, is extremely traditional when it comes to Chokhmah. He doesn't identify it with Torah, right? But on the other hand, he's also quite radical because he starts integrating philosophical ideas from the Greeks into it.
When is Heraclitus? Is he connected to?
I don't remember.
Similar time?
Yeah. So now I want to sum up. So what I tried to do in this class, and I hope I succeeded, is to show you that there was, for your average Israelite, a certain way of understanding the world and behavior. And that this particular way of viewing the world was challenged by certain more strictly monotheistic streams. Namely the Deuteronomic / covenantal school, the priestly cultic school, and the wisdom tradition, because the wisdom tradition is very monotheistic, quite clearly. No angels, no demons, no even mention of any hint of sub-powers, except for, what is Chokhmah. I mean, Chokhmah comes as close as possible to that, but isn't. And so there were these elites within Israelite society responding primarily at first to the destruction of the northern kingdom. And from that disaster, trying to decide how to avoid another one. It doesn't happen, but they try. And they're the people who ultimately, whether again this is a grand coalition or not, they're the ones who really put together the vast majority of the Tanakh. They ultimately produce the Torah. They produce these reformers.
These three schools you mentioned?
Well, I would say primarily, again, the melding of the Deuteronomic and the priestly. The wisdom people, I don't think were involved in this.
You're saying these were people who came from the north to the south?
The Deuteronomic starts in the north, it comes to the south. The priestly is the H school is in the south. They develop their own ways of doing things, but ultimately it somehow all comes together, probably during the Babylonian exile, to produce the Torah. One of the interesting things about this process that produces the Torah is the preservation of dissenting opinions. In other words, why did they preserve J and E? Why did they show 4 different accounts of the Sinai revelation? Why did they edit it all together? They could have very well left J and E out of the Torah entirely, and they would have had a shorter book, much shorter, but it could have very nicely, it could have worked. So why did they do that? Why did they include all this stuff from these earlier sources that they were reacting against? This is a fascinating issue. And I think part of it has to do with an idea that comes down to this very day in Judaism, which is respect for the dissenting opinion. And the belief in the notion of the multiplicity of perspectives is a good thing. Otherwise, why did the priestly tradition put J and E into it? I mean, they had to in some way have respected these earlier material, even as they disagreed with it.
That's how you maintain the power
Vital,
of the,
maybe.
of the
I mean,
community.
Robert, you had a point.
I was going to say wisdom.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, we rejoice in the fact that they did that. They did not produce a narrow, dogmatic text.
There's like also respect for, you know, it's Hashem Omra. It's like sort of what came before.
Yeah, but you know,
Their
J&E
attention is-
represents such a different way of looking at God than P and certainly D, but yet they kept it anyway, you know? And I think that's a wonderful thing that they did.
I think Rabbi wanted.
And one other point, the inclusion of Ecclesiastes and Job in the Ultimate Tanakh is another example of this, right? They're very radical books.
What it did was it didn't exclude people who did not agree with him in totality. It said that the nation as a whole is more important than just my belief. Even though I am a Kohen and I am going to rule for all time, it's still okay.
But you know, but the point is, since these guys were the intellectual elites and they were the ones making the documents, they could have excluded it, but they didn't. And that to me, and as a result, the impact of all of these books, but if you look, for example, at the influence of the priestly school or the influence of the D school on later Judaism is enormous, absolutely enormous.
Rabbi, if it was just Leviticus, I could not be a Jew.
Right, but Leviticus, in fact, is really important in the later Jewish tradition, but so is Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy introduces the notion of a Torah, a book that you can carry around with you wherever you go, and you can survive if you've got the book, right? And you don't have to have the temple. It's better to have the temple, but you don't have to have the temple because God really lives in heaven, and as long as you pray, that's good enough. I mean, there's some very important ideas that allowed us to survive. So I'm going to end there. I hope you enjoyed this. I enjoyed preparing this. It was I was able to really look at a lot of interesting material that I either had looked at before or hadn't, and so I'm going to turn off the recording right